Thank you very much for the invitation to attend this forum. And I hope that some of the things I say will have resonance with the New Zealand context, because primarily it's the Australian context that I'm talking about, but the issues I think are quite generic. You can tell from the title that I'm looking essentially at the conventional way of talking about workplace language literacy and numeracy, the dominant way of talking about these issues, often contradicts what actually goes on in workplaces. Sometimes when you actually dig around and you start working in workplaces, it doesn't quite. There's a bit of a disconnect between the official policy, the conventional way of talking about it, and actually what happens. And that's some of the things I'll be talking about. Some of those sorts of issues here, with hopefully implications for what partnerships might be involved with language literacy and numeracy providers. I'll also be indicating a particular approach to literacy and numeracy in the workplace that we call a social practices approach, but that'll become a bit clearer hopefully as we move through. I don't want to spend much time on this, but I have worked in the TAFE system in New South Wales, which I think is similar to your polytechnics, for over 20 years, and I was an adult literacy practitioner. Yeah, it's working now, thanks. As an adult literacy teacher and mainly as a head teacher. So I was organising and planning and administering workplace programs. So I've got, in a sense, that sort of hands-on practical experience of workplace literacy and numeracy. And more than a decade ago, when I finished my PhD, that also was a critical look at workplace literacy and numeracy programs, in particular looking at local council workers. But I think the reason I've been invited over here today is that I'm working on a project at the moment with two colleagues at the University of Technology, Sydney, Keiko Yasukawa and Tony Brown, called Investigating the Crisis. And basically, because there is a perceived crisis, especially in the manufacturing sector with low literacy and numeracy levels, we wanted to actually go into 2 or 3 workplaces and really dig around in depth and find out, well, what is this crisis? What does it mean on the ground in manufacturing companies? And most of what I have today relates to just one of those companies. We're still doing the research, we're still collecting data, we're still visiting the companies, and we haven't actually published anything or written anything, but most of what I have to say relates to one particular company that did things, I think, rather well, but a little bit differently from the conventional way of seeing things. Now, to start off though, I've mentioned the word crisis. I think it's a fair enough term, a crisis. This is how literacy and numeracy is often portrayed, certainly in the Australian context, and I would assume that you get similar sort of news items similar to this. The first one was in 2008, and that was after the OECD International Survey, you know, the Adult Literacy and Life Skills Survey. I mean, that's what drives your literacy and numeracy agenda, I'm sure, and it's also what drives the Australian context as well. So we had that kind of news that, you know, nearly half of Australians can't read and write properly. The last 2 quotes came from a conference in Melbourne just a couple of weeks ago, an ACER conference. So they're pretty current. So it's this idea that the nation needs to invest in adult literacy and numeracy because literacy and numeracy is seen to relate to productivity, and that it's a major problem in our workplaces, and it's a crisis. That's the way it's perceived. It's probably why we're having a conference like this today as well. If governments didn't perceive that link between literacy and numeracy and productivity, they wouldn't be putting money into the field. Not to the same extent anyway. Now, my aim today, or part of the aim really, is to challenge this dominant way of thinking, this conventional way of thinking, the crisis approach. And present an alternative approach, which we as the researchers in this project we're working at the moment, seems to be apparent in this one particular company that I'll mention later, talk about later. But I did find a quotation from Tara Fennick, a professor at Stirling University, that in a sense encapsulated, I think, excuse me, the conventional way of thinking about literacy and numeracy and workplace learning. She said it's all about skill acquisition in a deficit-oriented, individualist and universalist model of work education, where the educational goals are upskilling through control and measurement. Now, what I'll be focusing on today will be the deficit-oriented, individualist and universalist. In other words, I'll be providing a demonstration that counters each one of those in a particular workplace. Now, this particular workplace that I'll explain a little bit later, the actual details, it's a different way of looking at literacy and numeracy in the workplace. The particular example I'll be talking about, in that workplace, the focus is really on the strengths and the abilities of the workers rather than what they lack. A deficit-oriented approach primarily focuses on what people don't have, what they lack. And this workplace that we've been observing and doing some research in, their focus isn't on what people lack in terms of literacy and numeracy, it's on the strengths and abilities of those workers. It's not a deficit-oriented workplace. By the way, this workplace, they don't call themselves a social practice approach. It's just, for them, it's just a natural way of doing things. But us as researchers, from what we saw, we tried to link it back to, theoretically, to what we call a social practices approach. There's also so that's the first issue, the deficit-oriented. It's not deficit-oriented in this company. Secondly, the focus is more on collective learning. This company I'm looking at is in lean production, where everyone's working in teams, and it takes account of the broader social relations in the work. It doesn't focus on individuals lacking skills. This idea that learning workplace practices is basically about individuals and the skills that they have. There's a lot of research around at the moment that's indicating there are other factors that maybe are as important, if not a lot more important. The way people relate in groups, for example, and teamwork. We've always got this focus on what an individual, almost like a bag of skills that an individual has. That seems to be our primary focus. But in a workplace where it's working in teams, those individual skills maybe aren't quite so important. And there's theoretical work at the moment in practice theory and activity theory that indicates that it's not just about an individual skill. It's a lot broader than that. There's work on the socio-material factors, on the use of computers, on material artefacts and the role that they play in changing workplace practices. It's not just about an individual person's skill. And I think we've got some examples in this company of collective learning rather than individual learning. And thirdly, this company looks at a range of different literacy and numeracy practices at work. The idea is to focus on practices rather than individual literacy and numeracy skills. I mean, the basis of a social practice approach is this focus on how literacy and numeracy are used in practice, used and valued in practice. In other words, social practice researchers don't really value the generic literacy and numeracy skills that are seen to transfer to every other context in life. Their focus is on how people use literacy and numeracy. And in this workplace that I'm going to talk about, their focus is primarily on the workplace practices, and they're not really concerned about any underpinning generic literacy and numeracy skills. And to undertake this kind of research and analysis, it really requires a fairly close look at what goes on in the workplace. It means that the researchers or analysts of the workplace really need to get into the workplace, spend a lot of time observing, talk to a lot of people. You see, very often workplace programs are about a language literacy and numeracy provider going in there, talking to the manager. They get an idea of, oh, look, there are problems in this workplace, and then they start trying to determine those sorts of issues. But if you go in on the ground and you spend a lot of time observing and you become part of teams and you interview workers, sometimes you get a different perspective on language literacy and numeracy in the workplace.